Okay, welcome everyone. This is Carl Nelson again with Center for Energy and Environment. Thank you for joining the webinar. We'll go ahead and get started now. In just a minute, I'll turn it over to our featured presenter, but just wanted to say a few words of introduction. First of all, CEE is heading up a statewide energy efficiency potential study to look at the potential for utility-funded energy efficiency from 2020 to 2029. And this webinar is part of that effort. We have an advisory committee that has been meeting for about a year now, and this issue about lifetime savings is one of the things that has come up in our conversations there, and so we wanted to dive into that in a little bit more depth, looking at what Illinois has done with shifting their policy from first-year savings to lifetime savings goals, and thought this would be a good way to inform both people who have been part of our advisory committee as well as other folks who are interested in that topic as well. So we're well into our potential study now. We have one more advisory committee meeting coming up that will be later this summer, and we will have a draft of that report out later this summer and for review, and the final one will be out in the fall. Just to let people know about that. And with that, I will turn things over to Chris Neme, who with the Energy Futures Group, who has worked with some of the folks in Illinois and will be telling us more about what they've done there. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So just a few words about my firm, Energy Futures Group, and what we do. We're a small consulting firm. There are 7 of us based in Vermont. We do a lot of work on policy development, particularly regulatory policy, program design, evaluation, cost-effectiveness analyses, and testimony, both regulatory testimony and legislative testimony on a range of energy efficiency, renewable energy, strategic electrification, and building code issues. And we do that work for a range of clients, from government agencies to advocates to regulators to utilities, and have done so since we were founded about 8 years ago, and for clients in more than 30 states, a bunch of Canadian provinces, including Manitoba and Ontario, and a little bit in Europe and China as well. My presentation here today is going to focus on three topics, kind of underneath this broader question of lifetime savings. The first is a discussion of the pros and cons of the common practice of setting goals based on first-year savings or annual savings. Mostly the cons. The second is I'm going to walk through a series of different options, most of which have been tried in some fashion or another, someplace or another, to address not just the savings that show up in the first year, but the longevity of savings as well. And then lastly, I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into one of those options, which is the cumulative persisting annual savings goals approach that was adopted by legislation in Illinois in late 2016 and is now being implemented in plans that the electric utilities filed there last year and have begun to implement at the beginning of this year.
And I'll just jump in here for a second too, Chris, and say, please, if people have questions, please use your interface to ask those. There is a questions tab there, and start typing those in. We will be taking breaks throughout the presentation to answer those. So there's you shouldn't wait till the end to do your questions, because we'll be taking some of those questions in the middle of the presentation if we have those.
Yeah, my plan is to pause at the end of each of these 3 sections of the presentation to field questions on each part. Okay, so let me jump into the first part. First year savings goals. This is most states in the U.S. Base their savings targets, the savings requirements, on first-year savings or annual savings, essentially the amount of savings that show up in the first year that an efficiency measure is implemented or introduced. There are some advantages to this. I think perhaps the most notable is that it's really easy to understand. It's easy to tell somebody that we saved with our programs this year enough electricity to be equal to 1.5% of our annual sales. That's a concept that's easy to explain and to convey to people. And because it's a way of expressing savings goals that's used quite universally, and in addition, it has to be computed no matter how you set your savings goals. Everybody reports it, and as a result, it's easy to benchmark against. And in fact, that's really one of the primary reasons why ACEEE uses this performance metric as the basis for its scorecards. For example, its annual state energy efficiency scorecard. However, there's some really important, and I would argue, just insurmountable disadvantages to focusing on first-year savings for your savings targets. Most fundamentally, they don't account for savings longevity. They treat savings for a measure that lasts 1 year the same as savings for a measure that lasts 10 years or 20 years or longer. And as a result, first-year savings goals or achievements relative to first-year savings bear no relationship to the value of the savings. We all know, heck, we know this from our own personal experience. If someone came to your house and said, I can save you 20% of your electricity consumption for 1 year, or if they came and said, I could save you 10% of your electricity consumption, but every year for the next 20 years, most people would much rather have the second one, even though the savings in the first year is much less, because we know that there's much more value to savings that have a longer life. A very much related point is that first-year savings has no relevance to system planning. When utilities need to assess whether they need to build new power plants if they're vertically integrated, or make new investments in the transmission and distribution system, they need to understand what loads are going to be year over year for 5, 10, 15, 20 years out into the future when they're making those investment decisions. How much savings you got in the first year of a program doesn't really tell you much to help inform thinking on that kind of perspective. It's also really important to note related to those disadvantages that a focus on first-year savings can have perverse incentives. And there's lots of evidence to show from across virtually every jurisdiction that uses them that this has been true to some extent. And the reason for that is that many programs and measures that have savings that are relatively short-lived are cheap to acquire, that is, on a dollars per first-year kilowatt-hour basis, but alternatively much more expensive on a dollar per lifetime kilowatt-hour basis, or you could say the same thing per first-year therm of gas or lifetime therm on the gas side. So to give kind of to demonstrate this point of the perverse incentives, I've got a hypothetical example here. And it's expressed in gas. The first measure would save you 20 therms of gas. It would last 1 year and cost you $10. And therefore, the cost per unit of first-year savings is 50 cents. And it also costs you 50 cents per lifetime therm saved. The second measure would save you 100 therms, but it would last 20 years and cost you $200 program dollars. That's a $2 a therm, first-year therm saved, so it's 4 times more expensive than the first measure, but it's only 10 cents per lifetime therm saved, or 80% cheaper if you look at this from a lifetime perspective. So if you're focused on first-year savings, you might think, as your savings goal, you might think this first measure is wonderful and way better than the second one, but if you actually consider the longevity of savings, that conclusion gets flipped on its head. You might think of this as it's exactly true, and the example wasn't kind of created for this purpose, but it's kind of like thinking of an initiative to promote the replacement of clogged or dirty filters furnace filters, and is the first measure in comparison to helping a customer upgrade to a more efficient furnace in the second example. Now, that kind of perverse incentive can affect program choices or the level of emphasis you put on programs within your portfolio. People often talk about this issue in the context of residential behavior programs, and it certainly has implications there. But residential behavior programs are not the only ones that are affected by this kind of skewing of things when one focuses on just first-year savings. And in addition, even within programs, especially programs that have multiple measures, think commercial and industrial prescriptive rebate program that can have 50, 100, 200 different measures within it, it can affect the level of emphasis a utility might want to place on promotion of those different measures within a single program. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of each. So on the program side, this graph depicts the relative cost per unit of savings for 9 different efficiency programs in an actual program portfolio for 2018 for a Midwestern utility. I should note that that utility's portfolio included 3 other much more expensive programs that I haven't included in this graph because they don't help illustrate the point. To explain what you're looking at here, the vertical axis is the percent of the average portfolio cost that the cost per unit of savings each of these programs represents. So if your bar hits the 100% line, then that means that the cost for that program is about equal to the average cost for the portfolio. If the bar hits the 50% line, then that means that that program is pretty cheap. It's half the cost of the portfolio as a whole per unit of savings. And if the bar hits 200%, that means it's a relatively expensive program. That program costs twice as much per unit of savings as the portfolio as a whole. And what's interesting here is the difference between the green bars and the blue bars. The green bars are what that picture looks like if you're focusing on first-year savings, cost per first-year kilowatt hour. And the blue bars are what that looks like if you focus on cost per unit of lifetime savings. And you can see the most obvious one of note is the residential behavior program, the 5th one over. You can see it's something like 30 or 35% of the cost on a first-year savings basis of the portfolio as a whole. But it's actually more like 130%. It's more expensive than the average cost per unit of savings for the portfolio as a whole if you look at lifetime savings. And incidentally, that's assuming a 3-year measure life for residential behavior. If you were assuming a 1-year life, that blue bar would be much higher. But again, it's not just the residential behavior program. Retro-commissioning, C&I retro-commissioning looks much less attractive relative to the cost per unit of savings for the other programs in the portfolio if you go to a lifetime perspective. Residential lighting goes from a below average cost per unit of savings on a first-year basis to an above average cost if you take into account, as I have done here, the fact that the 2020 ISA standard is going to significantly reduce savings in the out years of new LED light bulbs that are installed. So, and there are some programs that work the other way. Both the C&I prescriptive rebates and the C&I custom rebate program get less expensive per unit of savings when one moved to lifetime savings relative to first-year savings. So that's a picture at the program level. Comparing programs to each other, the relative cost per unit of savings for different programs. If you look at it at the measure level, this is a look at about 30 different measures out of a C&I prescriptive rebate program that had more than 100 measures. So it's by no means an exhaustive list here. But the point is that there are many measures which get much more expensive when you look at them in terms of cost per unit of lifetime savings than per first-year savings. And there are other measures that go the other way. And then there are some where it doesn't seem to change all that much. So it's clear that if you are a utility, even just in the context of implementing a single program like a prescriptive C&I rebate program, and your goals were now expressed in lifetime savings instead of first-year savings, you might change the level of emphasis on the different measures within that program in terms of which ones you want to promote most aggressively. So that's the kind of introductory kind of context setting for the concerns about first-year savings. Before I jump into the some alternative approaches that focus more on the longevity of savings, I will pause and see if there are questions that folks had. John or Carl, any questions that have come in?
Yes, we're just unmuting here. It looks like there was one question about we'll be able to get a copy of these slides later. Yes, we will.
Sure.
I think we were planning on putting those up on a website that we have for the potential study, and we can email that link out after we get that up on the site. And then there was a very specific question on the residential HVAC. Somebody was asking what's the number of years of life for that residential HVAC. So yeah, I think that would be the right chart, Chris, for that.
Yeah, I'm not positive, but I believe it's a mixture of things. The residential HVAC program and for this particular utility included rebates for high-efficiency central air conditioners, high-efficiency air source heat pumps, and smart thermostats. So it's probably a mixture of 10-year measure lives for the thermostats, something like that, and then I'm not sure, 15 to 18 years perhaps for the central air conditioners and air source heat pumps. But I'd have to double check, but that's my intuition, is it's a mixture of those things. It's a weighted average.
Yeah, and it looks like we had that same question for geothermal, what's the assumed life of that? So that's maybe something we can...
Yeah, and I don't think that this particular program portfolio included any geothermal.
Okay.
Geothermal would be, generally speaking, in my opinion, would have a much longer measure life than the rest of the measures in that portfolio. On the other hand, it would probably have a much higher cost per unit of savings too, so those things might counterbalance each other.
Right. Okay. And then we had another question related to policy. In Minnesota, our goals are set in terms of first-year savings, as you've talked about, Chris, but the utility financial incentives are affected by lifetime savings. Do you have any thoughts on using tools other than the goals to create incentives to pursue longer life savings? So I guess this would be an example of where the incentive structure might be able to account for those longer lifetime measures, I think is the point being made here.
Sure. And yes, I think the idea of focusing your shareholder incentives on lifetime savings or some variation on lifetime savings as a complement to first-year savings goals, that would, my own personal perspective, that would be a good thing, and it would certainly help to focus on the things that matter most, if it is indeed you focus on lifetime savings. That said, one would, from my own personal perspective on this, I would want someone to make a pretty compelling case why I would want my savings target still based on first-year savings, even if my performance mechanism is focused on lifetime savings. Making the performance mechanism focus on lifetime savings would help, and perhaps help a lot, but why not align them both that way?
Right, that makes sense. And then we've got, there's more questions that have been coming in here, even as we've been talking. Another question is related to, I assume this is for some of the behavioral measures, but do they include differences? Let's see, I'm having a hard time reading the question here. Not differences, not just strictly due to lifetimes, but things like persistence or erosion of persistence over time. Are those factors considered in the charts that you presented?
In the charts that are presented here for the residential behavior program, I simply took the first year savings and multiplied it by 3. Now that's not because I think when you implement a residential behavior program that the savings that show up in year 1 will be the same in year 2 and 3 and then drop to 0 in year 4. That's more of kind of a weighted average. I think that there's evidence from evaluations that have been done in recent years that if you were to run a residential behavior program for a year or 2 and then stop, that in the year after you stopped, you're still going to see savings, but it will be less than the previous year, maybe 20% less, and then it might be another 20% less the year after that, and another 20% less the year after that, and so on. And that my 3 years is an attempt to get, apply a single number to kind of that average stream of eroding savings over time.
All right. Let's see, and we have a couple more questions in here. Looks like this one is more just making some comments here. One point is lifetime savings isn't ignored by programs that focus on first-year savings, since lifetime savings is still part of the cost-effectiveness evaluations, and I think that gets to the earlier point that it's also included in the incentive structure, at least in Minnesota. So just making the point that there's other places where lifetime is considered. And then...
I would agree with that, but only to a point, as it relates to cost-effectiveness screening anyway. Mm-hmm. And that is, lifetime matters only to the point that you need a benefit-cost ratio of 1.01 or better. Once you've crossed that threshold, whether it's a 3-year life, 10-year life, 20-year life, is in the context of first-year goals, if that were the only thing you had in front of you, it doesn't matter anymore. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a yes-no thing. Is it long enough lived given its cost to get us over the cost-effectiveness threshold? And once it is, we don't differentiate between it anymore. Mm-hmm.
And then another point is it puts more emphasis on getting the persistence correct. So if you're going to include, things beyond just that first year, if that savings changes over time, if it's a 20-year life, then that could be quite a big impact depending on the assumptions you use for that. Any comments on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely true that if you're going to focus on lifetime savings, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the following section, so this may be a good segue to go into the next section, so make sure we have time to finish. It's absolutely true that focus on lifetime complicates things a little bit, and certainly puts a little bit of a different twist on the things you would pay attention to when you're doing your EM&V, for example. And at some level, one of the, ultimately a policy call on how you establish your goals, you need to balance complexity and transparency with accuracy in terms of what you're ultimately looking for. And not let the perfect become the enemy of the good, because if you get too complex, it can be problematic. On the other hand, if we really are concerned about the value of savings over time, we need to pay some attention to that. And it's all a question of how you strike the right balance. And as we go into the next session, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the options and some of the pros and cons of some of those options, and then I'll talk a little bit at the end about how Illinois came to the balance that it came to on that.
And I think that is a good segue to go ahead and start on this next section. We have another comment, but that's related to the policy and this cost-effectiveness question.
Yep, okay. So we can come back to all of these too. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about a range of options, and there may be others, but these are the ones that I've given thought to over the years as a way to try to address concerns about the value of the longevity of savings in the way that savings goals are set. So the first option is to keep the first year savings goal, but to put a limit on how much of the savings can come from from short-lived measures, like no more than 10% of the savings can come from measures with a life of less than 5 years. That's just a hypothetical example for illustrative purposes. The second option is kind of, in some ways, the kind of flip side of that one. We keep first-year savings as the basis for the goal, but give a bonus for long-lived measures, like you get to count, you get to multiply your kilowatt-hour savings by 1.1 for every unit of savings that came from a measure with a 10-year life or longer. The third option is to keep first-year savings goal, but pair it with an average measure life either requirement or kind of adjustment factor. If I had to get savings equal to 1.5% of sales with an average life of 10, and if I got 1.5, but my average life was only 8 years, that's really the equivalent of 1.2%, and I'd have fallen 20% short. Or if my average life was 12, that would be the equivalent of getting 1.5%, and better than was hoped for. The fourth option is the purely lifetime savings, which is essentially the same thing as the third one, but just expressed differently. A fifth option is discounted lifetime savings, which would be an approach that you might take to in understanding that the savings life matters, but that generally speaking, all other things being equal, savings in the 20th year are not worth as much as savings in the 15th year, which are not worth as much as savings in the 10th year, and so on. The farther out the savings go, the less valuable they are. A sixth option is to express goals in terms of the net present value of net benefits. So you're expressing them in the economic terms and the economic value of the savings. And the last one, which I've put last simply because it makes for a nice segue into the last section of the presentation about Illinois, is to express goals in terms of cumulative persisting annual savings. It's a term used in the Illinois legislation. And what it basically means is how much savings in any given year, let's say 2025, are being realized from measures that were installed going back to whatever starting point you cared about. In Illinois, they started with 2012. So in 2025, how much savings are still persisting from measures installed between 2012 and 2025? And then you have a series of annual goals that are expressed in that way. Those are 7 options that I've given some thought to, and I'm going to quickly walk through some of the pros and cons of each, and then we'll segue into the Illinois discussion. First-year savings with a limit on how much of those savings can come from short-lived measures. One advantage of this is it preserves the easy-to-understand articulation of first-year savings goals, and then, of course, it curbs what some might consider to be excessive promotion of short-lived savings. The disadvantage is that the cutoff for how you define short-lived savings is somewhat arbitrary. Is it 3 years, 5 years, some other number? And very much related to that point is this is kind of a blunt instrument approach. Once you've decided what the cutoff is, anything less than 5 years kind of fits in this bucket. It treats all measures that are below that cutoff the same. A 1-year measure life is the same as a 4-year measure life, and all the measures above it are also treated equally. You don't distinguish between the value of a 6-year life or a 10-year life or a 20-year life. And it can also reduce some portfolio flexibility for utilities who are attempting to implement a balanced portfolio. The second option, first-year savings with a bonus for long-lived measures. The advantage is this provides an incentive to promote longer-lived measures. However, it shares some of the same disadvantages and more of the previous examples. The cutoff is arbitrary. Are we talking, a bonus for anything longer than 10 years, anything longer than 15? And then again, it treats all measures that are below or above that cutoff point as equal, even though they really aren't. Also, in addition, this kind of distorts the meaning of first-year savings. If you're giving bonuses, so you say, well, I got 1.6% savings as a percent of sales. Well, really, it was 1.4% or some other number, but when you add my bonus, it got up there. Now the clarity of what we mean by first-year savings is kind of a little bit blurry. And Another disadvantage is that much of the bonus may end up getting given to measures that would have been included in the utility's portfolio anyway. And I will say that this mechanism was part of the Michigan utility shareholder incentive mechanism several years ago, and in my look at it, that last point really held there, that before this bonus went into effect, something like 40 or 50%, I can't remember the exact number, some substantial portion of their savings were coming from measures that were 10 years or older, which is the cutoff that was used at the time. And that number didn't grow very substantially with the implementation of this bonus, maybe because the bonus wasn't big enough, but even if it went up 15 or 20 percentage points, the majority of the bonus would have still been paid for stuff that was still going to be 10 years or longer already. The third option, a first-year savings goal with an average measure life adjustment. Advantage is it still preserves the easy-to-understand first-year savings goal, and secondly, it assigns equal value to all different measure life increments. There isn't this arbitrary cutoff where you get a bonus or a penalty or a limitation. One disadvantage is that it, and this would be true of lifetime savings as well, is that it effectively treats future savings the same way as current savings, and that may or may not be appropriate given the way avoided costs are structured. I don't know of any entity, any jurisdiction that's currently using this approach, but wanted to put it out there. Lifetime savings is the fourth option. It's conceptually easy to explain and understand. It assigns equal value to every measure life increment, just as in the previous example. But also, as with the previous example, it values future savings, in the 15th or 20th year, the same as shorter-term savings. And it's a little harder to put goals in context. So again, I think the principal advantage of first-year savings is when you say we're going to get savings equal to 1.5% of annual retail sales, people understand what that means. If I said I'm going to get lifetime savings equal to 17% of annual retail sales, I'm not sure that people can get their heads around that quite as easily. I believe that this is lifetime savings is the current focus in Wisconsin, although I'm not positive about that. It is the focus in Michigan for the shareholder incentive mechanism. Someone asked a question earlier, what about first-year savings goals as the kind of metric that you're judged on whether you met your target or not, but basing shareholder incentives on a lifetime metric. That's exactly the way the system is currently constructed in Michigan, following some recent settlement agreements. And lifetime savings is also the focus as it relates to the gas utilities in the Canadian province of Ontario.
And I would just point out, Chris, too, that although we don't use that for the metrics, the lifetime savings, as has been pointed out, is what we use in Minnesota for the incentives, although not for the goals.
Right. Do you use lifetime savings, or do you use utility cost test net benefits?
Correct. Utility cost test net benefits, but that has the...
Yeah, it accounts for measure life.
Yes, it accounts for measure life. Yep.
Sure. We'll get to that example shortly. Discounted lifetime savings, this is a variation on the previous one, but would discount future savings so that they're not worth as much as nearer term savings. In theory, that one advantage of this is it values savings over their entire life, but treats near-term savings as more valuable. And it could be a better reflection of economic value depending on what your avoided costs look like. However, it's much more complex to communicate and to compute, and there's some potential for reduced transparency if the same discount rate isn't used across utilities, or if discount rates change over time and so on. I'm not aware of any jurisdiction that uses this approach, and I'm not sure, I wouldn't recommend it either. The sixth one, net present value of lifetime benefits. One of the advantages of this is it values savings over the entire life of the measure, as with some of the previous ones, but it's based on the actual economic value, so it's the most accurate representation of economic value. One disadvantage of setting your goals this way is that this is really complex. Now you've got all kinds of variables from all different elements of your avoided costs to your measure life and a whole host of other things that need to be accounted for when you're computing what you accomplished, but more challengingly, when you're trying to set the savings target. And that gets particularly challenging, especially if you want to think about progress over time and establishing goals in a uniform way across jurisdictions, when things like avoided costs can change quickly over time and can be very different from one service territory to another. So that makes it really challenging to compare. Again, I don't know of any examples of jurisdictions that are setting goals this way, but like Minnesota, there are several utilities in New England that have some of their performance incentives tied to net benefits. Actually, that's true in Ohio, in the Carolinas, and in some other places too. And lastly, the option that was adopted recently in Illinois, cumulative persisting annual savings. It's the one advantage. It's the only approach that directly aligns savings goals with the things that need to be considered when doing utility system planning. And obviously, it inherently adds value to longer-lived savings relative to much shorter-lived savings. However, there are some disadvantages to this as well. You got to set your goals in place for many years into the future for this to be effective. If you're only setting 3 or 4 year goals, then it doesn't really matter if you were implementing a measure that has a life of 5, 10, or 15 years. It's all past the horizon of your site. It also doesn't distinguish between or differentiate between different savings lives for measures that are still producing savings at the end. So in Illinois, they set annual targets from 2018 all the way to 2030. But if I implement in 2018 a measure that has a 15-year life and I implement another one that has a 20-year life, those are both producing savings past 2030. And so, nominally, I wouldn't care. And that gets to be an increasingly bigger issue the closer you get to the last year for which annual targets have been prescribed, unless those targets get re-upped with some significant advance notice, over time. Again, it's noted this is the system recently adopted in Illinois, and it's also the approach that the European Union took with their energy efficiency directive a couple years ago. And I will pause there. Lots of questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, we have one question here, and I'm not sure if this is the right time to answer it, but I'll say it. There's a factor that regulators are considering in California, which may or may not be a good thing for Minnesotans here, the fact that it's in California. But that factor is requiring that energy efficiency customer incentives to be based on lifetime or life cycle savings. Do you have any comments on that, and how does that kind of fit in with this? Do you know about that, I guess? It sounds like it's a relatively new...
I don't,
okay.
but it's, and I'm not sure that I understood the question correctly. The way I heard what you just read was that the savings targets be based on lifetime savings or life cycle savings.
Yeah, and it sounds like in California they've actually directed utilities to base the incentives on...
to base the incentives that they offer to customers.
Yep.
Yeah.
The rebates and so forth, the incentives that go
right.
to customers.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I do have an opinion about that, which is I don't, without knowing the details, I may get myself into trouble here. But if the point is that we should pay a financial incentive, and we should base the amount of financial incentive we give to customers to invest in efficiency on the life of the measures that they're installing, I generally not very favorably disposed to that perspective. I personally believe that financial incentives are a tool, that an important one, but not the only one. Marketing and education and training and so on are others that utility or non-utility administrators of efficiency programs can use to persuade their customers to invest in efficiency measures that they otherwise would not invest in.
Mm-hmm.
And savings life by itself is not an and before we go there, and if it's a tool that you're using to convince your customers to invest in efficiency, you should only spend as much as is needed. And if the market barrier is very steep for a given measure for whatever mix of reasons, you may need to pay a higher incentive. And if the market barrier is not very steep, you can pay a lower incentive. I think the financial incentives ought to be based on what is necessary to get customers to make the investment. There are some measures with long lives that aren't very hard to convince customers to invest in, and some measures with shorter lives that are much more difficult. And that should be a more of the driving factor in how you design your programs.
And that makes a lot of sense. I think there'd be a lot of people that would agree with that here as well. A question on cumulative persistent savings approach. Wouldn't that encourage a last-minute rush to short-lived savings as a compliance target approaches? You kind of hinted at this. And
yeah.
Wouldn't this imply that you have to get your goals set particularly carefully?
Well, yes. Insightful questions, both. The first point is absolutely true. If Illinois doesn't change its law until 2020, until the current 2030 target is reached, or the year before, there will certainly be lots of incentive to just load up on short-lived savings in the last 1, 2, 3 years of what they're doing. Mm-hmm. My hope will be that what happens in that state is that as you get within 6, 7, 8 years of the endpoint gets moved back out again some distance further into the future. As I said earlier, the cumulative persisting annual savings approach only really works in terms of providing the right incentive to invest in longer-lived measures if the last annual goal that you're focused on is some distance out in the future.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. There's a couple other questions, but I think that we'll move on, and if we have time, we'll come back to those at the end. Okay.
So Illinois. As in most places, the way targets used to be set in Illinois was based on first-year savings. How much new annual savings you produced was all that mattered. A 1-year savings life was worth just as much as a 10-year savings life. And the amount of savings you got from measures installed in previous years were irrelevant in terms of whether the utility met its targets or not. The new targets are based on this new concept, CPAS, that kind of just rolls off the tongue. It counts all savings from measures installed since 2012. There's a complicated set of political reasons, I think, for why that was the starting point, which we don't need to get into. The savings from the 2012 to 2017 programs that persist each subsequent year in the future from 2018 to 2030 are specified in the legislation. The reason for that was people didn't want to be fighting about that after the fact. So there was an estimate of what that trajectory would look like, which I'll show you in a minute. And then those values were just specified in the law. But the new program plans that were governed by the law that start, the first 4-year plan of which was from 2018 to 2021, the utilities are going to need to track their persisting savings for 2018 and beyond, and how much of those savings die off over time. In a nutshell, the formula is in the numerator. What is the cumulative persisting savings from the measures installed since 2012? In the denominator, you're dividing that number by the amount of annual sales from 2014 to 16 from customers other than large exempt customers. There was a change in the law at the very end that exempted customers larger than 10 megawatts from the program, which is about 10% of Commonwealth Edison's sales and about 25% of Ameren's. And maybe since ComEd is a little more than twice the size of Ameren, it's probably in the 15% range for the state as a whole. So this is what the savings trajectories look like. The gray line at the bottom is the amount of cumulative persisting savings that are specified in the law for the 2012 to 2017 programs. So I believe that number is at 6.8% in 2017. It drops down to 4% in 2021, to 2.5% in 2025, and to 1.5% in 2030 as a percentage of sales. The Commonwealth Edison target is the orange line, and you can see over time by 2030, Commonwealth Edison is going to need to get savings as a percent of sales equal to 21.5%. Again, 1.5 percentage points of that are the savings from the 2012 to 2017 program. So the amount of new savings that ComEd has to get over this 13-year period is 20 percentage points. And there's kind of an analogous set of numbers that you can come up with for Ameren, whose target was a little bit lower. So Ameren needs 14.5 percentage points of new savings. Here's just a little example to kind of illustrate the point of how this gets calculated. You can see for this 4-year plan period, Commonwealth Edison's target starts at 7.8% in 2018, goes to 9.1% in 2019, 10.4% in 2020, and 11.8% in 2021. And then you can see the same declining amount of savings persisting from the 2012 to 2017 program. So in 2018, those 2012 to 2017 programs are deemed to have 5.8% savings. So Commonwealth Edison would need to produce 2% incremental annual savings in 2018 to meet its target for that year. The difference between the 7.8 and the 5.8. They're actually planning to get 2.2 to exceed the target by a little bit. Then in 2019, nominally they only have to get another 1.3% savings. However, that's 1.3 percentage point increase in persisting savings. They also have to account for the fact that the amount of savings persisting from the 2012 to 2017 programs went down from 5.8 to 5.2. And of their 2.2% savings, incremental annual savings that they're planning in 2018, 0.1% of that is going to be eroded away from one-year measure life savings down to 2.1. So they've got to offset that 0.7 decline in persisting savings from previous years before they can start making progress on that 1.3 number that goes up to 9.1. And then you can see how that math works. As you go out further from time, the amount of savings from 2018 is expected to continually decline. About a quarter of the 2018 savings, almost 20% of it, almost will be no longer persisting 3 years into the program portfolio and have to have been offset. It's also important to know one other change in the Illinois law. Well, there are many other changes, but one other one that's tied to the way these goals are established is that for the first time, energy efficiency spending is being rate-based instead of expense, or at least the utilities have the option to rate-base it, and to earn a rate of return that's tied to their goal achievement. If they meet their goal for a given year, they get a rate of return that's equal to their normal rate of return. If they exceed their goal, they get a bonus, up to a 200 basis point bonus for getting 25% above the goal. And if they fall short, they get a penalty, although ComEd's penalty starts at 99%, 98%, and so on below its goal for reasons that were undoubtedly political and hard to, and I don't know the details of. Ameren doesn't see a penalty until it falls below, it has a deadband from 85 to 100% and gets a penalty below 85% of its goal. So, what are the implications of this? How has it played out so far? I think the first point that's worth making is that the average measure life of the savings that are in both ComEd's and Ameren's portfolios has increased. I don't have the numbers. I wasn't able to quickly get them together for Ameren, but in ComEd's case, their plan has them getting close to an 11-year measure life in 2018 for their 2018 programs, and their 2019, 20, and 21 programs are just short of 12-year average life. And that's compared to an 8 to 9-year average life in previous plans. Part of that is from a reduced emphasis on residential behavior programs, and Ameren has a dramatic reduction in the amount of savings that they're now forecasting to get from residential behavior. And they also, in Ameren's case, interestingly and smartly, I think, are using rotating cohorts for the limited residential behavior program participation that they do have. Because Illinois' TRM for the residential behavior program has, rather than a fixed measure life, it says you get all the savings in the first year, and then 80% of that's persisting in the second year, so and then 60% in the third year, and 40% in the fourth year, and so on, something like that. Having a rotating cohort where you deal with one set of customers in 2018, and then you get to count that kind of declining persisting savings from that cohort in subsequent years, and then the second cohort in 2019 with the same pattern has some advantages. There's also utilities have learned a lot about residential lighting and its implications in the context of a 4-year plan, particularly the impacts on of the 2020 ISA standards, which are going to change the amount of savings that even an LED installed in 2018 will produce in 2021 and 2022 and so on, significantly reduce it. So in essence now for LED lamps, there is a dual baseline for savings calculations. And that created a special challenge in 2021 because there was this kind of savings cliff. And as a result, when they were putting their plan together, this is not where they started, but ComEd ended up saying, well, we're going to eliminate all standard LED promotions after 2018. They just don't produce enough persisting savings in the out years for it to be valuable enough to us to continue to promote. There's also been, to one of the earlier questions, an increased focus on measure life and the TRM update and evaluation work, and an increased focus on savings life in some of the R&D spending and third-party procurement, program procurement efforts that the utilities are launching this year, and I can get into any of that if folks are interested. And I will stop there.
All right, we have one question, and you may have answered this already, but the question is, how is technology obsolescence factored into the persistent savings? So for example, that is given here is CFLs were preferred, but now LEDs would be the preferred choice. So would CFLs have a negative now if they were still installed? So this, to me, is more than just the codes that you talked about, but maybe baseline, other things that might affect the baseline.
Yeah, I would kind of lump that into I'm not sure that that's a lifetime versus a first-year issue. I think that that's a baseline issue just in general. As the baseline changes, whether because of codes and standards or because of just changing in the market, you have to account for that baseline when you're estimating savings, and that would be true of whether you're estimating first-year savings or whether you're estimating lifetime savings and shifting baselines over time. One thing that is worth noting, and this is really important to the utilities in Illinois, and I think ultimately fair to them. When we estimate savings that are persisting in a given year, so in spring of 2019, when they filed their report and said, here's what we accomplished in 2018, and not just in terms of how much savings our 2018 measures produced in 2018, but how much they will produce in 2019 and 2020 and 2021 and 2022 and so on, based on the measure life assumptions we all had in place at that time. Once we all agree, or the regulators agree ultimately, that those estimates are the best estimates available at the time, those numbers get locked in. And if we learn 5 years from now that, one of the measures installed in 2018 didn't have quite as long a life, or actually had a longer life than we thought at the time, it doesn't matter. The 2018 savings, once they're agreed upon as the best information at the time, get locked in, and now we move on to the next year.
Right. Another question about the applicability of the cooperative-owned utilities, the municipal utilities and other community-owned utilities, co-ops. Did Was that impacted by the Illinois legislation, or
No, the
mm-hmm.
Illinois legislation under either the old law or the new law does not impose requirements on municipal or cooperative utilities.
Do you know if there are other states that are having those discussions that would impact co-ops or munis with moving to a lifetime savings goal?
There are other states certainly that have requirements for munis and co-ops to participate. I am not positive if I have an example, however, in a state that's moved to some form of focus on lifetime savings as the performance metric. It may be true in Michigan for the I forget what they call it. There's an entity that the commission has hired to deliver programs to smaller utilities who did not want to run their own. And I suspect, but I don't know for sure, that there's some focus there in terms of performance on lifetime savings. Mm-hmm. But it's not a statutory focus. It would have been a contractual one.
Okay. And related to that, you've talked about the electric utilities, but is there, were the gas utilities part of the conversation in Illinois, or why not were they included in that?
Great question. No, they were not. The new law really only changed the responsibilities in a significant way for the electric utilities. There were some minor changes, well, depending on your perspective, minor or not so minor changes to the gas utilities requirements, but they were only to align the planning horizons with the electric planning horizons, because there's a lot of joint program delivery, number one. And number two, one of the other changes in the Illinois law was that previously a quarter of the funding that was collected from both the electric and gas utilities was given to a state agency to run programs for low income and public buildings. That got consolidated for both electric and gas utilities under a single utility umbrella. So those changes apply to the gas utilities, but the way the savings goals are redefined, the ability to earn shareholder incentives, the ability to rate-based efficiency spending, changes in spending caps, all of that stuff applied only on the electric side and not on the gas side. And why? Politics.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any reason why that wouldn't work on the gas side versus the electric side?
Conceptually, no. And as I noted, in Michigan, both DTE and Consumers Energy are dual fuel utilities, and it's not their statutory savings targets, their performance incentives are tied to lifetime savings as a result of recent settlement agreements. In Ontario, the two regulated gas distribution utilities have for 7 or 8 years now, I'm not sure, but at least 5 or 6 years now, have had their savings goals expressed in lifetime savings terms.
All right. Well, I see we're at time here. I apologize. There's a few questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, but I think in fairness, we'll wrap it up now. I want to thank you, Chris, very much for your presentation, and we'll be putting that up on the website, the slides, as well as the entire recording of this webinar for people to take a look at a later time.